Nathan Rivers walked through Stanley Park. It was rare for him to be there, away from his tight schedule and endless emails. The quiet of the park, between the towering trees and the occasional sound of children's laughter, felt like a stark contrast to the glass and steel halls where he spent his days. For a moment, he wondered what he was searching for. Peace? Nostalgia? Or perhaps something he couldn't quite name. He stopped near a carousel, watching a group of children running excitedly around a golden retriever. The contagious laughter of one boy, no older than 8, caught his attention. The boy seemed to embody pure energy, with bright eyes and a fearless way of facing the world. Nathan allowed himself a faint smile, something rare for him. But his contemplation was interrupted when the boy noticed his presence. Without hesitation, the boy ran toward him, holding a bubble that was slipping from his fingers. "Hey, mister," the boy said, stopping in front of Nathan with uncontrollable curiosity in his eyes. Nathan bent down slightly, surprised by the audacity of the little stranger. "Hello. My mom has a picture of you," the boy said bluntly. Nathan blinked, confused. "Really? Are you sure it's me?" The boy nodded so vigorously that his light brown hair bounced like a dog shaking off water. "I'm sure. It's an old picture. You look older now. Like, a lot older." Nathan let out a quiet laugh. "Well, thanks for the compliment, I guess. Who's your mom?" The boy turned and pointed to a nearby bench. Nathan followed his finger and saw a woman sitting with an open book in her hands. She was leaning forward, her eyes shifting between the page and the boy, as if she had mastered the art of divided attention. It was impossible not to notice the sudden movement she made when she realized she was being watched. She closed the book quickly, almost as if she was trying to hide something. Nathan froze. He recognized her. It was Sophie. The world around him seemed to slow down. Each step he took toward her felt like crossing a minefield, where every memory might explode if he dared step in the wrong place. She wasn't just a figure from a distant past. Sophie was the what-if he had buried under layers of work and ambition. "That's her," the boy said, grabbing Nathan's hand without ceremony and pulling him toward the bench. "My mom's Sophie." Sophie stood up before they even got close. Her wide, startled eyes met Nathan's, and for a moment, no one said anything. It was as if time had frozen in a silence that screamed everything they weren't ready to say. She held the book against her chest, as though it could shield her from something. "Sophie," Nathan said, his voice coming out as a near whisper. "Nathan." Her response was short, almost defensive. Leo looked from one to the other, confused by the tension hanging in the air. "You already know my mom?" Nathan stared at Sophie, waiting for her to say something, but she turned her gaze to her son, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sophie began but hesitated. "Yes, Leo, we know each other. It's been a long time." Nathan couldn't take his eyes off her. So many questions hammered in his mind, but none seemed appropriate at that moment. What was she doing there? Why did she still have something of his? And what was this feeling stirring inside him? A mix of anger, longing, and something he couldn't define. "You haven't changed," he said, even though he knew it wasn't true. Sophie had changed, but something about her was still familiar. A quiet strength, a balance he had always admired and never fully understood. She let out a short, humorless laugh. "I think you need glasses." Leo tugged at her shirt, pointing to the book she was holding. "Show him the picture, Mom." Sophie tensed, clutching the book closer to herself. "Now's not the time, Leo." Nathan tilted his head. "Is there a picture of me in there?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It's just an old thing. It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," he replied, firm but not aggressive. "Sophie, you still have a picture of me? Why?" She looked at him for a moment, and something flickered in her eyes, a mix of sadness and anger. But before she could answer, Leo interrupted, pulling Nathan away. "Come see Baxter. He can catch the frisbee in the air." The boy's enthusiasm was impossible to ignore. Nathan glanced back at Sophie, trying to read her, but she averted her gaze again. It wasn't the moment to press her, and he knew it. Still, as Leo led him toward the field, Nathan was certain that conversation was far from over, and for the first time in years he felt something different, something dangerous, something inevitable. Nathan looked out at the panoramic view of Vancouver from his apartment in Cole Harbor, but the glow of the city lights felt distant and irrelevant. The truth was, He couldn't stop thinking about Sophie. And Leo. Especially Leo. There was something about that boy that drew him in, something he couldn't explain. It was as if, deep in the recesses of his mind, a connection already existed, even if he didn't yet understand why. He tried to focus on work, on contracts that needed signing, on presentations that demanded his attention. But the words on the paper blurred into meaningless shapes. His thoughts kept returning to the cafe conversation, to the tension in Sophie's face, to the way she seemed to be defending her life against an intruder. Why did she still have a photo of him? Why was she keeping so many secrets? And why did Leo? He sighed, shaking his head in an attempt to clear his mind. But it was no use. The next day, he made a call he knew was risky, but necessary. Daniel Moore, a trusted private investigator, answered with the efficiency Nathan always appreciated. Daniel had helped with corporate espionage cases and complex acquisitions in the past, but this assignment was different. Very different. "I need you to investigate someone," Nathan said bluntly, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Of course, Mr. Rivers. Who's the subject?" "Sophie Bennett. She lives here in Vancouver. She's a nurse. She has a son named Leo Bennett, about 8 years old." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Daniel replied. "This is personal?" Nathan hesitated. "It is, but I want you to handle it discreetly. Don't invade her privacy more than necessary. I just need answers." Daniel agreed, and the rest of the call was short. When Nathan hung up, he felt the weight of guilt settle on his shoulders. He had never liked prying into other people's lives, especially Sophie's. But she had closed so many doors that he didn't see another choice. If she wouldn't tell him, he would find out on his own. The following days tested his patience. Daniel was meticulous, and Nathan knew better than to rush him. While he waited, he buried himself in work, trying to make up for lost time with a feverish level of productivity. But even the most impressive numbers in his company couldn't distract him for long. The image of Leo, his laughter, his curious eyes, seemed etched into his mind. When the phone finally rang, it was late at night. Nathan answered on the first ring. "What did you find?" His voice was firm, but an underlying tension betrayed him. "Sophie Bennett is exactly who you said she was. A registered nurse, working 2 shifts at a local hospital. She's lived in a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood for about 8 years. Nathan nodded, even though Daniel couldn't see him. "And Leo?" "Leo Bennett is 8 years old. No father listed on the birth certificate. It seems she's raised him on her own from the beginning. There's no evidence of co-parenting or external support. She's apparently done everything on her own." Nathan's heart raced. What Daniel was saying aligned perfectly with the calculations he had been making since their first encounter. Sophie had Leo a year after they parted ways, but it still didn't make sense. She had been so adamant that Leo wasn't his son. "Are you sure about this?" Nathan asked, his voice low, as if he feared the walls might overhear. "Absolutely. Sophie is private, but her neighbors describe her as a dedicated mother. There's no indication of financial or legal complications. It seems she has a quiet, but challenging life. She works hard to support them both." Nathan closed his eyes, feeling a crushing weight in his chest. He imagined Sophie running from one shift to the next, coming home exhausted, only to care for Leo. Meanwhile, he had been at the pinnacle of the corporate world, surrounded by luxuries that now felt insignificant. "Do you want me to keep digging?" Daniel asked. Nathan shook his head, then remembered to speak. "No, that's enough. Thank you." He hung up, but the newly uncovered truth continued to echo in his mind. Sophie had been alone, raising Leo, and he had no idea. What else was she hiding? He needed to confront her, but this time, it would be different. He wouldn't plead for answers. He would demand the truth, and he wouldn't leave without it. The hospital was bustling, as usual. The sound of hurried footsteps and muffled voices filled the corridor as Nathan walked through, ignoring the curious glances from doctors and nurses. He knew he wasn't the kind of visitor who went unnoticed, especially in such a functional environment. But he didn't care. He needed to talk to Sophie, and nothing would stop him. He found her in a break room, seemingly trying to carve out a moment of peace. Sitting in a chair with a coffee cup in her hands, Sophie looked exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights and the relentless routine of a mother working 2 shifts. When her eyes met Nathan's, the wariness gave way to something else: shock. And then irritation. "Nathan, what are you doing here?" she asked, standing up quickly and glancing around as though afraid someone might overhear. "We need to talk, Sophie," he replied firmly. "This isn't the place for that," she shot back, crossing her arms as if trying to create a barrier between them. Nathan stepped closer, undeterred. "The place doesn't matter. What matters is that you owe me some answers." She took a deep breath, clearly trying to maintain her composure. "I don't owe you anything." "Then tell me why Leo doesn't have a father listed on his birth certificate. Tell me why he's 8 years old, Sophie. Why does the timing match exactly with when we were together?" Sophie froze, as though each word was a direct blow. Her expression hardened, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of guilt, perhaps. She glanced toward the corridor for a moment before looking back at him. "Not here," she repeated, her voice lower. "Meet me after my shift. I'll explain everything. Just don't make a scene." Nathan nodded, though his patience was wearing thin. "I'll be waiting." They met at a cafe near the hospital. Sophie looked even more worn out than before, but her posture suggested she was bracing herself for a fight. Nathan waited for her to start, but she seemed hesitant, her fingers twisting a simple ring she wore on her middle finger. "Well?" He finally broke the silence. "Are you going to tell me what's going on, or do I have to guess?" Sophie exhaled slowly, as if preparing to dive into deep waters. "Leo is my son. That's no secret, and I have nothing more to reveal." He tilted his head, crossing his arms. "You expect me to believe that? The math adds up. He has my smile, Sophie. Don't tell me that's a coincidence." She stared at him, her eyes flashing with anger and something that looked like pain. "You don't know what you're saying." "Then explain it to me," he insisted, his voice low but filled with intensity. "Because so far, all you've done is push me away. And the more you do that, the more it feels like you're hiding something." Sophie looked at him for a long moment before finally relenting. She lowered her gaze, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with her coffee. "I was scared," she said, her voice barely audible. Nathan didn't respond immediately, waiting for her to continue. "When I found out I was pregnant, you were already gone. You were so focused on your career, on your ambitions. I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want to be the reason you gave up everything, so I decided not to tell you." He blinked, surprised by her honesty. "You think I wouldn't have taken responsibility? That I would have abandoned you?" She finally looked up at him, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. "I don't know. I just knew you had plans, and I wasn't part of them. I thought I was doing the right thing." Nathan felt a mix of anger and sadness wash over him. "And now, do you still think hiding it was the right thing to do?" She shook her head slowly. "No, I know I was wrong, but I didn't know how to go back, and after a while, it felt like it was too late." He ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. "Sophie, you took 8 years of his life away from me. I missed his first steps, his first words. Do you think that's been easy for me?" "No, I don't think it was easy," she replied, raising her voice. "But it wasn't easy for me either, Nathan. I did the best I could. I raised Leo alone. I worked double shifts. I made sacrifices you can't even imagine. It's not like I've had an easy life while you were busy with your millions." The sincerity in her words disarmed him. He looked at her, and for the first time he saw how broken she was, despite the strength she tried to show. "I'm not here to take anything away from you," he said, after a long silence. "But now that I know, I can't just walk away. He's my son, Sophie, and I want to be part of his life." She stared at him for a long time, as if trying to measure the sincerity in his words. Finally, she nodded, albeit reluctantly. "He doesn't know anything about you," she said quietly. "It's going to take time." Nathan took a deep breath, feeling some of the tension in his shoulders ease. "I've got all the time in the world, as long as you let me be what I should have been from the start." Sophie looked away, saying nothing more. And in that silence, Nathan knew the battle was just beginning. But for the first time, he felt he had a chance to fix what had been broken. Nathan stood at Sophie's apartment door, holding a simple bouquet of sunflowers, her favorite, something he remembered from a time that felt like it belonged to another life. He hesitated before knocking, feeling nervous, adjusting the collar of his shirt as if preparing for an important meeting. In truth, it was much more than that. It was the first step towards something he knew was delicate but essential. The door opened slowly, revealing Sophie with a cautious expression. She glanced at the bouquet for a moment before lifting her eyes to meet his. "You didn't need to bring flowers," she said, her voice calm but distant. "I know," he replied with a faint smile, "but I thought it might be a good start." She hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. The apartment was small but cozy. Photos of Leo were scattered on the walls, and a box of neatly organized toys sat in the corner of the room. Everything reflected a simple life, filled with care and love. Nathan felt a pang in his chest as he realized just how much he had missed. Leo appeared in the hallway, his face lighting up at the sight of Nathan. "You came!" the boy exclaimed, running to hug him. Nathan knelt down to meet him, Leo's genuine smile warming something deep within him. "Of course I came. I promised we'd plan something special today, didn't I?" "Can we go to the park with Baxter?" Leo asked, his eyes sparkling with excitement. Nathan looked at Sophie, who was watching the interaction with a mixture of apprehension and relief. "If your mom doesn't mind," Nathan said, keeping his tone light. Sophie sighed, crossing her arms. "I won't stop you. Just don't make him promises you can't keep." "I never would," Nathan replied, the seriousness in his voice making sure she understood. Stanley Park felt like a different place that day. Maybe it was the way Leo ran across the grass, tossing the ball to Baxter while laughing with unrestrained joy. Or maybe it was Sophie, who, though keeping a bit of distance, began to relax, allowing herself to smile more often. Nathan watched everything, trying to imprint every detail into his memory, as if he needed to make up for the lost time. As Leo played with Baxter, Nathan approached Sophie, who was sitting on a wooden bench, her gaze fixed on her son. "He's incredible," Nathan said, sitting down beside her. "He is," Sophie replied with a small smile, "and you have no idea how much trouble he can be sometimes." Nathan chuckled, though his expression carried a seriousness. "I want to know everything about him, Sophie. The good, the bad, the moments he makes you laugh, and the ones that make you want to pull your hair out." She looked at him, surprised by his honesty. "That's not going to happen overnight, Nathan. It takes time." "I know. I'm not asking for everything all at once. I'm just saying I'm here, and I'll keep being here if you let me." She averted her gaze, biting her lip the way she always did when she was nervous. "You say that now, but your life is different, Nathan. You have responsibilities, commitments. I don't want Leo to get attached to you only to be disappointed later." "I know I have a lot to prove," he said, his voice softer, "but I'll do it, because he deserves it, and so do you." Sophie was silent for a long moment before finally nodding. "Just take it slow. He's just a boy." Nathan smiled, a subtle relief showing on his face. "I promise." That evening, as Sophie prepared dinner and Leo begged Nathan to help him with a puzzle, something began to shift. The tension that had hovered over them seemed lighter, as if the air had grown less dense. Sophie watched from a distance as Nathan and Leo worked together on the floor, laughing when a piece didn't fit where Leo insisted it should go. She had never imagined this. Never thought Nathan could be part of the life she had built on her own, with so much effort. And yet, there he was. And something inside her, something she had been holding back for years, began to unravel. As Leo laughed, pointing out how Nathan had messed up the puzzle, Sophie smiled. Maybe she had been wrong to think he wasn't capable of being there. Maybe, just maybe, there was room for him in this little family. And more importantly, maybe there was room for something more. The sky in Whistler was gray, threatening snow, but Leo didn't seem to mind. He ran across the open field near the cabin, tossing snow into the air while Baxter jumped toward it, trying to catch it. Nathan watched the scene beside Sophie, both bundled in heavy coats. The cold air surrounded them, but the atmosphere was light. For the first time in years, Sophie seemed less tense. And Nathan? He felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: belonging. "He loves the snow," Nathan commented, breaking the silence between them. Sophie crossed her arms, her eyes fixed on her son. "He always has. In winter, he practically forces me to come here. He thinks Whistler is magical." Nathan smiled. "He's not wrong. There is something special about this place." "Not just the place," she murmured, almost inaudibly, but Nathan heard her. He looked at her, curious, but said nothing. They were there because he had insisted. Whistler had been special for them in the past, and he wanted to share a bit of the magic he and Sophie had experienced with Leo. But he also knew this trip was a kind of test, a neutral ground for Sophie to trust him with more than just supervised moments. "It's strange," she began after a moment, "seeing you here with him." "Strange how?" he asked carefully. "Like you've always been part of this." She looked him in the eye, her honesty disarming him. "But you haven't." Nathan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. He knew she was right. His absence had been a choice, even if an unconscious one, and the void he'd left could only be filled now with effort. "I'm not going to pretend I can erase the years I missed," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "But I'm here now, Sophie, and I'll do everything I can to make sure he never feels my absence again." She looked away, biting her lip as she always did when trying to hide her emotions. "He's just a boy, Nathan. He thinks you're amazing. But if you leave, I'm not going anywhere." The certainty in his voice made her look at him again. "No matter what happens, I'm here to stay." A strong gust of wind blew, making Sophie huddle into herself. Nathan instinctively took off his scarf and offered it to her. She hesitated but accepted it, pulling it around her neck. "I don't know if I trust you," she admitted after a long silence. "Not completely." Nathan nodded. "I understand, and I don't expect you to trust me just because I'm saying the right things. Trust is something you build, and I'm willing to do that." She sighed, her gaze shifting to Leo, who was now crouched down, shaping a snowball. "He needs stability, Nathan. It's always been just the two of us, and it worked." "I know it worked," he replied gently. "And you've done an incredible job, Sophie, better than I ever could have done on my own. But he deserves more. He deserves everything." She didn't respond, but her expression softened. Nathan knew Sophie carried the same guilt he did. Guilt for the choices they'd made, for the silence they'd kept. Maybe she hadn't done it alone, but they were both trapped in the consequences. Now all he could do was prove, one day at a time, that he was here to stay. "Dad?" Leo's voice rang across the field, calling to them. The title caught Nathan by surprise, but it didn't unsettle him. In fact, it warmed him more than the fiercest fire ever could. Nathan smiled and looked at Sophie, who for the first time didn't seem to object. "Go on," she said, taking Nathan's hand briefly before letting it go. "He's waiting for you." Nathan ran toward Leo, their laughter blending as they tumbled into the snow. Sophie watched them from a distance, the icy wind brushing against her face, while something deeper warmed her heart. Maybe, she thought, there was room to trust again. Maybe. Stanley Park was bustling that day. The sound of children's laughter and dogs running filled the air, but for Nathan, Sophie, and Leo, the world seemed to exist only between them. They were sitting on the same bench where it had all started, surrounded by the park's tranquility. But now things were different. There was a connection, still fragile but tangible. And most importantly, there was hope. Leo was crouched on the grass, teaching Baxter how to catch a frisbee. Sophie watched her son with a calm smile, while Nathan, sitting beside her, seemed more at peace than ever. He glanced at her, feeling the need to break the silence. "He seems happier," Nathan said. "He is," Sophie replied, her eyes still on Leo. "You've brought something new to his life. He's always been a cheerful kid, but now he has something more." Nathan absorbed her words quietly, feeling the weight of them. He knew his presence had changed the dynamic of Leo's life, but he also knew Sophie still carried a certain hesitation. He understood. Trust had to be built, and he was willing to keep proving his worth, to both Leo and her. Sophie turned to him, crossing her arms. "You've been consistent, Nathan, and I appreciate that. But I need you to understand something. I don't want you to make promises you can't keep." Nathan looked at her, his expression serious. "I would never do that, not with the two of you." She stayed silent for a moment before continuing. "Leo deserves to know the truth, and I think it's time to tell him." Nathan felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He knew Sophie had struggled with this decision, and the fact that she was ready meant more than words could express. He nodded slowly. "We'll tell him together," he said, his voice soft but firm. "He needs to hear it from both of us." Sophie studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of hesitation. When she found none, she nodded. "After dinner," she decided. "At home, where he feels safe." Later that evening, Sophie's apartment felt warmer than ever. Leo was on the living room floor, drawing what appeared to be Baxter in his most heroic pose. Sophie and Nathan exchanged a glance before sitting down beside the boy. "Leo, can we talk to you for a minute?" Sophie asked, her voice calm but carrying a serious tone. Leo looked up, curious. "Sure. Did I do something wrong?" Nathan chuckled softly. "No, not at all. Actually, we want to tell you something important." Leo sat up, still holding his pencil, his eyes attentive. Sophie took a deep breath before speaking. "Do you remember when we met Nathan at the park?" she asked. Leo nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, that was when he saw Baxter do the frisbee trick." Sophie smiled, but her tone remained serious. "Well, since then, Nathan has been spending more time with us. And that's because he's not just someone we met at the park. He's your dad." Leo blinked in surprise and looked at Nathan. "Really?" Nathan leaned forward, his smile genuine. "Yes, Leo, I'm your dad. And I'm sorry I wasn't here before, but I'm here now, and I want to be with you every step of the way moving forward." Leo was quiet for a moment, processing the information. Then, without warning, he threw himself into Nathan's arms. "That's amazing!" he exclaimed, his smile lighting up the room. "I've always wanted a dad." Nathan held his son tightly, feeling tears well up in his eyes. Sophie watched them, discreetly wiping away a tear that had escaped. She knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but in that moment, she felt she had made the right choice. A few days later, they were back at the park, walking together as a family. Leo ran ahead with Baxter, laughing and shouting for the dog to fetch the frisbee. Sophie and Nathan walked side by side, their steps naturally in sync. "Thank you for not giving up on us," Sophie said, glancing at him. Nathan smiled. "That was never an option." She nodded, smiling back, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. The past no longer mattered. The future was uncertain, but it carried something the three of them needed: love, trust, and the promise that they would face whatever came their way together. And that afternoon, under Vancouver's open sky, their new life began.
If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. We need your support.
Better stories are yet to come.